Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us in the second webinar during this week-long festival event, brought to you in partnership with JCDecaux. Yesterday, we heard from Justin Gibbons, the founder of Work Research, who discussed a number of themes around the topic of public and private media and the rebalance of these in post-COVID landscape. The session delved into the topic of trust, and we presented some of the research into the importance of public media and out of home in particular in delivering brand trust. So whilst yesterday reminded us of the need to use public media to drive trust and consideration in the consumer purchase journey, today's session is all about attention and ensuring we get more of it, again by using public and private media in combination. I'm delighted to welcome guest speakers Mike Follett, and Managing Director of Lumen, and Chris Felton, Head of Insights and Data at JCDecaux. Lumen are an attention technology company that uses eye tracking to measure and predict the reality of visual engagement. They've done some fantastic and fascinating work to link the role of attention and memory and action, but they'll also share with us today what the key drivers of attention actually are. Chris will then take us through the theory into practice, presenting a number of case studies showing the creative learnings to help you get more attention from your public and private advertising, digital out of home, mobile working together. Before I hand you over to Mike, just to note that we do have a Q&A function available today. However, being conscious of your time, we propose bringing any broader questions into our discussion panel on Friday, and whilst any specific questions related to the content you hear today will come back to you on separately. So now I'll hand you over to Mike.
Hi guys, my name is Mike Follett. I'm the Managing Director of Lumen Research. As Tash said, we are an attention technology company. We've developed some technology that turns your computer or your phone's webcam into a high quality eye tracking camera. And we use this to understand the reality of attention across media, including out of home. Quite how we do it in out of home, I'll leave to Chris to explain, because he's got some really interesting videos to show you about how we measure attention in out of home. What Chris has asked me to do, though, today is to set up the broader discussion about attention, so that we can understand how out of home performs in comparison to other media, and then set up some case studies that Chris has to tell you about the relationship between how different media work together to amplify attention across media, but also how that relates in the real world to actual increases in brand uplift and sales. So if I hear the next slide then, please, Chris. The first thing to say about attention in general is that it is rare. Attention to advertising, it's a finite resource. No one has to look at your ads, and frequently they don't. I used to make advertising, and I used to work on Felix cat food, and I thought that everyone was as interested in cat food as I was. But what I forgot to remember is that I was paid to be interested in cat food, and that's why I noticed all the ads. In reality, most people don't care about cat food as much as I do, even today. In actual fact, people are very good at ignoring advertising. And if you go on to the next slide, Chris, we have a sort of an estimate of it. When it comes to digital advertising, which isn't half as good as many other media, but with digital advertising, what we find is that around about 82% of viewable desktop display ads don't get looked at. So IAS will say, don't worry guys, it's all fine, the ad was on screen, and it was there to be seen, tick that box. What our data from the eye tracking shows that even if the ads are technically viewable, in some cases as many as 82% of these things are not getting looked at. Now this is a big problem. just in terms of, the data is a little bit old now, about 3 or 4 years old, but just in terms of desktop digital display, that's about £30 billion worth of viewable ads that aren't getting viewed. So it's really, really important to start looking at the reality of attention. And that's what Lumen's technology allows you to do. So if you go on to the next slide, what we can also see is that attention is important because it links to both memory and to action. Now, this is the sort of thing that if you were just to tell your parents about, or your kids even, and you go, it seems so obvious. Ads can't work unless you look at them, or at least engage with them. Radio ads and TV voiceover and stuff is important, and audio is a very important way of doing it. But when it comes to visual media, if you don't look at it, it can't work. The second thing is that the longer you look at these things, the more likely it is to work. The engagement with advertising is super important. You need to get a minimum amount of attention of actual visual attention to make any impression and go into your people's heads. The second thing that we know is that ads can't work just in terms of recall, but they definitely can't work in terms of sales unless you start looking at them. So if you go into the next slide, or the next build here, Chris, what we've found working with the likes of British Gas, this data comes from British Gas on their online sales model. The ads that we know that people are looking at tend to increase in greater sales conversions. And the longer you look at ads, the more likely they are to lead to higher sales conversions. So attention leads to memory, but also leads to action. And that's the same pretty much across media. So if we go on to the next slide, what we can start thinking about is perhaps sort of 3 drivers of attention. Now, because time is short, I'm not going to go into all of these things, but what we do know is that the first thing is that creative is very, very important. Media. We're going to be talking a lot about media for the rest of this session, but the creative is wildly important. Some brands just have better ads than others, or some brands have more distinctive assets than others. Those yellow arches, or those golden arches, are a really easy shortcut to get people to remember the McDonald's. I think we'll be seeing some ads from a well-known soft drink, and the red and the white and the sort of that white ribbon sort of feature that Coca-Cola has means that their advertising can work far more efficiently than many other advertising, because people. It's a well-known image, but also it's the standard of creative is much higher than in other situations. So that's one thing. Creative is really important, but the context and the targeting are also really, really important. And so not denying the importance of creative, but this is the context and the targeting are the things that I'm going to talk about a little bit more now. So if we go on to the next thing, just to talk about the context, and one thing that we're going to be that I'm going to be talking about a little bit, but then Chris is definitely going to be talking about, is the idea of sort of coming up with one number for to judge the value of media. And we use this concept of an attention funnel as we go down, and this is going to be important, not just for my section but also for Chris's. So let's just talk through this attention funnel and how it relates to both context and targeting. So if you go into the next slide, please, Chris. We think of attention as like a funnel. At the top of the funnel, you might buy 1,000 impressions in any media. Here's the data for desktop MPUs, but it could be for any media. It could be TV, could be press, could be mobile, but equally could be out of home as well, as we'll see in a second. You buy 1,000 impressions, and by some miracle, there's no fraud. They all reach the screen. They're there. Of those impressions, about 57% of them will be viewable. Some of your clients might be buying more greater viewability than that and achieving greater viewability, but this is about average here. The average is around about 57% of ads are viewable, and if you follow it down, they're viewable for about 14 seconds or so. But that does not mean that 570 ads have been looked at for 14 seconds. That's not the case. Instead, what we find is that about 8% of those ads, or around about 8, actually get looked at. So instead of it being 570 ads of your 1,000 getting looked at, in actual fact, for desktop display ads like this, it's around about 80, which is quite a serious drop-off. The second thing to note is that they're not looked at for 14 seconds. On average, they're looked at for about 1.3 seconds. People just sort of glance at these things, which is an important thing to remember. Now, some websites, as we'll see in a second, are much better than other websites at generating. They're not all as bad as this. And even within that, some people will look at longer and many more people will look at it for less. This is an average here. But what you can see here is of your 1,000 impressions, 80 of them actually get looked at for about 1.3 seconds. To come up with one number here rather than 2 or 3 numbers, what we have here is this idea of an attentive seconds. If you had 1,000 impressions, 80 of them get looked at for 1.3 seconds. On average, you're generating 110 seconds of attention per 1,000 impressions. Now, this is an important number, an important sort of yardstick to judge against different types of media. And if we go on to the next slide, what we can see is we have calculated the attentive seconds for lots of different media. So working with a company in the States called T-Vision, they have a TV panel very similar to our digital panels that we have at Lumen. And it seems that if you were to buy 1,000 30-second TV ads, you might generate around about 6,000 seconds of total attention in terms of people noticing it and then noticing it for how long and then multiplying those things together. So that's 6,000 seconds for TV. If you were to buy 1,000 press ads, you might get around, and these are 25 by 4s, those sort of quarter-page press ads in a tabloid newspaper, you might get about 1,300 seconds of attention. If you were to buy 1,000 digital 6 sheets, you might get 838 seconds of attention. Obviously, if you were to buy 48 sheets, you get much more than that. If you were to buy a load of MPUs, which interestingly are a similar sort of size to digital 6 sheets, but on your phone, you get a remarkably similar amount of attention there. And if you were to buy a load of MPUs, but on a desktop, you get much, much less. Mobile is much better than desktop in general. So you can start seeing that you can use attention data as a common currency to compare between media. If we go on to the next slide, what we can see is it's not just comparing between media, but we can also compare within media. So this is data here for these MPUs on desktop computers. So this is a very simplified chart here, but we can also see that where you see these ads also makes a difference. What we have noticed a great deal recently is the way in which you engage with a website massively increases or decreases your chance of actually looking at the ads. This is exactly the same as we'll see in a second when we come on to out of home in particular. The environments you see out of home in have a big influence in that, and the way in which people walk quite slowly or drive quite slowly past a poster has an enormous effect on the attention that these things receive. But importantly here, what we can see is that magazines and newspapers, where people read very, very slowly and engage with the content a lot, lead to much more viewable time and much more attention to the accompanying advertising. Whereas at the other end, things like eBay and Rightmove people use those websites in a totally different way. Usually, you know, on eBay, trying to find a new pair of trainers, or you know, a Rightmove looking for a new house, or something like that. You've got a task in mind, which means that your attention patterns are very, very different. And the same ad has a much smaller chance of being noticed on those websites than on the likes of Grazia or The Guardian. So we talked just a second ago about attention between different media in general generating different amounts of attention. Here, this is about within media. And how attention is generated in different ways within desktop, you know, desktop advertising here, and the site itself making a big difference. So if we move on, though, that's about the context. What we also know is that the targeting makes an enormous difference. Like I said, those pictures of those two little boys, it appears that people are very good at avoiding advertising. And again, this might come as a slight shock, but pretty obvious. People ignore stuff that isn't very interesting to them, and the creative can make things more interesting to them. But also, what you're looking for makes a big difference as well. Advertising is, in many senses, something that we want to avoid in most cases. It's sort of like pollution until you need it, and then suddenly it becomes really quite interesting. You know, car insurance advertising is very boring until you need car insurance, and then suddenly you go, oh, actually, you know, I might look into that. Baby food advertising is all quite cute and, you know, sort of, but largely irrelevant for most of us until you have a baby, and then suddenly, holy crap, this is useful stuff, and you end up looking at it more. So what we found is that targeting stuff is really important. Working with the IAB, we've done some tests to look at this is desktop advertising here, and for they were using slightly larger format ads, so the results are a bit better. But what we found is if you're not in market or aware of the brand, then you get around about 660 seconds of attention using that funnel system I was talking about beforehand. However, if you're in market at all, suddenly you look at this stuff much more. And if you're in market and you know the brand, then again you have almost twice, over twice the attentive seconds. So targeting is really, really important in terms of getting attention, and it's also super important in terms of remembering the brand. If you, and here we see a similar sort of thing, but perhaps a slightly different shape in that curve. What we find is that if you're not aware of the brand and you're not in market, then these ads are eminently forgettable. If you're in market but unaware, you are more likely to remember these things, but it's still a bit. What you want is, and this I think relates to Justin's point from yesterday. Being aware of the brand and being in market at the same time means that people know what to remember, and the impact of ad recall amongst people who are aware, both well targeted and already aware of the brand, is super important. Which again talks a little bit about the importance of spreading the news about brands, even if people aren't necessarily right in the zone as we speak. But what we have here then is a unit of attention. This idea of this funnel, and Chris is going to be talking about that a lot and using that language a lot there. It's a unit of attention that we know differs by media, differs within media, and is affected by targeting. And finally, as you'll see, it's extremely affected by creative as well. But this attention stuff relates to recall, it relates to sales. We can measure it. What we need to do now is see how we can use this new currency of attention to help us understand how advertising works in general and how different advertising across different media works together in combination. and have this is necessarily quite simplistic because I just want to explain the general principles, but it allows us to go to a much more sophisticated level of understanding of how advertising works, and from this quite simple basis build up to quite a more interesting and complex story. And that's what that we're going to talk about in the next section. So you're going to the next slide, Chris. I can hand over to you.
Thanks, Mike. So how much more complex can you be than 2 + 2 = 5? So I've been fascinated by Mike's work for a long while, and I think it's great to think about attention in advertising. When I first saw his work on a stage, I was thinking, how can we use this in out of home? And he was talking about his new technology, about how to measure mobile advertising. So what we decided to do is work with Lumen to try and understand exactly how digital out of home could work with mobile. And Mike's kind of alluded to the reason for that. Well, first of all, so much money is spent in mobile, but also if you are creating a mobile ad, you are inadvertently creating a digital out of home ad, which can be displayed on a number of different screens. So our hypothesis was to try and test that. So how do we do that? So what did we do? So first of all, we recruited 600 people. This was in-street intercepts. So we were in Southend and Watford, recruiting people into the street and giving them some incentive to do so. We then asked them to watch a video. The video was of a shopping mall, which I'm going to talk you through in a short while. And then using Mike's eye tracking technology, people's eyes were tracked about where they were looking, what they were looking at, and importantly, which ads they were looking at. Now, the video was a natural walkthrough. There was no focus on the advertising. It was just a 5-minute walkthrough of a shopping mall without any prompting that it was an advertising test. So after they had completed the task, they were then exposed to their own Facebook or Instagram feed, so their own stories feed. The only difference is the tech that Mike has allows the adverts to be changed. So what we did is we inserted the same ads in the stories feed that they were exposed to in the walkthrough of the shopping mall. The camera, as Mike mentioned, is converted to an eye tracking camera, so is able to understand where people look and crucially how long they look for at these adverts. So with all that data, we can understand what the effect of the two media working together. So what I'm going to do now is just show you a couple of videos. So the company that we worked with, or I should say Mike worked with, is a company called Myriad. Now, they are more well known in Hollywood than they are in the research world. And you can see here 2 ads, Coca-Cola and EE. Now, those ads were put in there by Myriad. The reason that they work in Hollywood is because they are the visual effects company. In fact, they've won an Oscar for their visual effects before. So when you see a can of Coke on a table in a film, it's not really there. It's these guys that are putting those product placements in. So they know what they're doing, but they can also take their hand to advertising and attention. So that's how you got the ads in. Now what I'm going to do is show you a video of the mall, and it's kind of walking through. So is that sound on there? No. Okay. Basically, what you can see here is the walkthrough. The video and the heat map is showing a combination of all those 600 people and where they're looking. The video that you're seeing was used for Root, which is the currency for out home. It was used for the eye tracking work in that, which Mike was part of. What you can see here is people look around the mall. And also what's great, as you can see here with the ads that you're seeing here, is that people do look at out-of-home advertising. They do pay attention to it, which is pretty obvious because if they weren't to do that, they would walk straight into it. So the good news is people are looking at the advertising, but you can see here they're also looking at lots of other things as well. There's lots of other things to kind of take attention. So these results in, it's a realistic experience. So after they had done this, we then took this data together for how long people looked at the ads. So what you can see here is you can see the average time that people looked at the digital out-of-home ads. So 2 seconds doesn't seem like a lot of time, but that's the average. And then also 2 seconds on the mobile. Now, Facebook themselves, I think they publish a figure of somewhere between around 1.7 and 2 seconds. So this is a realistic figure. You look at an ad for about 2 seconds. And I think this is important when you start thinking about creative anyway, because you only have 2 seconds to get your message across. In out of home, your frequency will be somewhere of around 10 to 14 over a 2-week period. So obviously you get the opportunity to repeat that message over and over. But the key to this slide is those people that had looked at the digital out of home ads, they then looked at the mobile ads for 3 seconds rather than 2. So you had that enhanced effect that looking at the digital out of home ensured that you looked at the mobile for a little bit longer and you got more engagement. So there you get, instead of 2 + 2 = 4, you get 2 + 2 = 5, because you get that extra second. And when you're talking 4 or 5 seconds, 1 second is a high proportion of that. And it does make sense. The whole priming effect is not a new idea. If you think about how you travel on the tube, if you see somebody that you work with and you're traveling on the tube, you might well notice them and look again, and you will either run away or maybe go and have a conversation with them. And that's the whole idea that you have with this, is when you see something once, you then look at it again. And that really does work with advertising, particularly if it's the same between the same creative. But it's not just about attention. Obviously, intention is important and massively important, but you really want to understand further down the kind of the brand funnel. And what we wanted to find out here is, what does that attention actually mean? So what we found here is we tested 6 brands, and I'm going to talk to you about those brands individually in a second, about some learnings. But we found when we looked at the aggregate of all 6 brands that, first of all, spontaneous recall was up, prompted recall was up, but also message takeout. So the idea that you're remembering the brand that you're seeing and then remembering what they're trying to say to you is obviously massively key for any advertiser, because you then go on to act upon those messages. So that's kind of the research and what we found. But what we wanted to kind of also deliver in our messaging today was how to think about kind of mobile creative and digital out-of-home creative and how they can work together. Because I'm sure that pretty much all of you are planning and buying mobile. And what we'd like you to do is think about how those two things can work together, mobile and out of home. So what I'm going to do here is just talk you through each of the creatives and just to show you some kind of differences which may relate to some of the brands that you work with in your day-to-day life. So here you're seeing the mobile. So basically what these images show are the people eye tracking when they're looking at the mobile ad. And I think the first thing to kind of notice on this is when you look at this video, you can see all of the attention is at the top. And that's generally what we find with mobile. If you think particularly the stories feed, there's a bar at the top of the stories feed which counts down to when you see your next picture, and people are engaged at the top of the ad. What you also find here is for this brand EE, it's obviously an established brand. I'm pretty sure that logo in the bottom right hand corner, if you remove the EE and you ask people to tell you what brand that was, just the very colour would get a pretty high response rate. And you can see here that this really helped here, and the figures at the top are massively strong for this, and you can see how the mobile and the digital out of home increased attention, recall and message outtake as well. So really strong for EE. The next one that we see here is obviously probably an even more established brand in terms of Coca-Cola. Slightly different here. Again, you see all of the attention is at the top. Again, that pattern is something that we see all the way through here. But you can see here what happened here is top of mind recall. So that spontaneous recall is the thing that kind of is the kind of thing that was driven here, which is obviously going to be massively important for Coca-Cola, because in terms of prompted recall. I'm pretty sure Coca-Cola is going to come up very, very high when you're talking prompted recall. So moving that brand higher up that kind of awareness set. Now, this one was worth bringing to your attention because it's quite long. Now, sometimes and it's not necessarily sure what the message is. You do get some spontaneous recall, but I think kind of the learnings here is probably this is too long, and it's probably too long for both mobile and for digital out of home. But you can see here that the mobile and digital out of home is outperforming the digital out of home on its own. As we move through, we did some startup brands as well, because we didn't necessarily want to just use established brands like Coca-Cola and EE, because obviously the recall on these brands are going to be a lot lower because there's a lot less other media going on. This particular brand was a startup and also used static creative, which we probably wouldn't recommend. But you can see here again, the top of the image, faces working here for that, and driving attention rather than the recall or the message outtake. And then the final one is for Sony. Now, what's interesting here is the idea of faces, and I mentioned the idea of the tube and recognizing people. People recognize faces and are drawn to faces, and you can see here this particular film had Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt, both obviously massive Hollywood A-listers, and you can see that the attention was drawn by their faces as well. Also at the end of the ad as well, you see that the attention comes through on the animation. So you can see here, dwell on terms of face and kind of animation is really driving this forward. The recall on this was a little bit harder because it was the name of the film, but the message outtake was related directly to the stars that were in the film. So you can really see that using somebody's face or a famous person is really going to drive memory and ensure that people take that away. So that's it from me. And just before I hand over back to Natasha to close, I mean, I think what I'll just say to kind of finalise is just the idea that, well, Mike kind of said context and content is massively important to drive attention, and that's important everywhere, but obviously that is so apparent in out of home. There are so many different places where you can deliver a message, the ability to do dynamic creative as well now, and I'd urge anyone on the call to think about testing and working with ourselves and Rapport to work with Mike to kind of test creative that's going from mobile to digital out of home. The priming effect is something that is so apparent here and really easy to do. If you are doing one, if you are making mobile ads, you're making them for digital out of home. So make them work harder by using digital out of home. And that's it from me. So I'm going to hand back to Tasha, who's going to close up.
Thanks, Chris. There were some really interesting insights there. And for me, the first stat, that 82% of viewable digital displays ads aren't seen, is something that we should really be concerned about. And it highlights the need to place greater focus on and attention that our ads are and aren't getting. Simply knowing that we're providing an opportunity to see isn't enough. And the $30 billion investment in unseen ads should be sobering enough to ensure that we all place greater time and emphasis on what we believe to be three key areas. Firstly, ensuring that there are creative pre-testing of all ads, not just TV. Secondly, understanding the role and value of context and targeting in media planning. And then finally, understanding how different media channels can work together to amplify attention and ultimately deliver better business outcomes. So that's it for today. We have another really interesting session tomorrow at 10 o'clock. It's an extension of what you've already heard today. And as we delve into the two-screen future, digital out of home and mobile, there's also a chance for you to bag yourself some free award-winning research to prove the effectiveness of out of home and mobile campaigns. So please join us. Lastly, thank you to our speakers, Mike and Chris, and thanks to everyone who has joined the session today. We hope to see you again tomorrow.